He taunted her from the bench, dismissing her with a sneer as if she didn't belong, telling her to sit down, to be quiet as if justice was something he could control. But what he didn't see was the badge hidden under her jacket. She wasn't there to testify. She was there to observe, to record, to expose a courtroom that punished flesh for crime. At first, she said nothing. Only her eyes saw everything, and when she stood, the silence was louder than any gavel. Because when pride overshadows the law and ego overrides truth, what happens when the woman you tried to silence holds the power to end your career? If that strikes you as a whisper in a storm, like and share this story. The courtroom buzzed with the typical shuffle of papers and muted whispers that accompanied the start of another long docket. It was 8:58 a.m. when Selene Ward stepped into courtroom 4C. She wasn't late, but she wasn't early either, just precise. Every move she made was intentional, calculated. Today, she wasn't here as a federal inspector. She was just Anna Mercer, a quiet observer in a navy blue sweater and beige slacks, notebook in hand, blending into the third row of the gallery like wallpaper. She had done this many times before. Enter, observe, listen, disappear. But today felt heavier. At 9:01, the courtroom stood as Judge Marshall Gaines entered, robe flowing, chin high, a man who had ruled this bench for nearly 2 decades. His word carried a weight sharpened by years of unchecked authority. He didn't just preside, he commanded. The first case called was a young black teenager, no older than 16, charged with resisting arrest. The boy sat with wrists still red from the handcuffs. His public defender, barely older than a law student. When the attorney tried to speak on the use of excessive force, Gaines waved him off without a second glance. "No need for speeches," the judge barked. "He ran. He fought. Let's proceed." Selene didn't flinch. She simply wrote one line, then another, her handwriting neat and deliberate. Gaines's eyes caught the motion. His gaze sharpened. "You there, in the third row," he said, pointing with a slight jut of the chin. "Yeah, you in the blue sweater." Heads turned. Even the defendant looked up. Selene met his gaze, calm and polite. "Yes, Your Honor." "Who are you here with counsel media?" "I'm just observing, sir." Her voice was soft, clear, unapologetic. The judge's lips tightened. "Well, this isn't a classroom, and I'm not interested in someone scribbling notes like this is a protest rally. If you want to play activist, there's a park across the street, not here." Selene didn't argue. She didn't plead. She closed her notebook with a quiet snap, stood slowly, nodded once, and walked toward the exit graceful, composed, silent. But the silence she left behind was deafening. A woman in a floral blouse near the back shook her head slightly. The bailiff looked down. The boy's mother clutched her purse tighter, and Judge Gaines. He tapped his gavel, muttering, "Let's move on." Though his eyes kept drifting back to the space where she had been. Selene had been dismissed from many rooms before, but this time, she let it happen, because the courtroom wasn't the goal. The system was. And Gaines had just made his biggest mistake, assuming that the woman he cast aside was merely taking notes, not realizing she was writing his reckoning. The door to the tiny office creaked as it opened, located just 2 blocks from the courthouse. It used to be a tax preparation shop. Now it was federal property under no clear signage, no receptionist, and no hint of importance from the outside. That's exactly how Selene Ward liked it. She stepped inside, letting the door close behind her with a soft click. The room was modest scuffed wood floors, blinds half drawn, air scented faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper. No plaques, no photos, just a long desk, a file cabinet, and silence. Selene hung her blazer on the chair, pulled her badge from around her neck, and set it gently beside her notepad. Office of Inspector General, Senior Federal Investigator. Titles were useful tool, not identities. She sat, opened the drawer, and pulled out a single manila folder. Zion Kelly, age 15. The face that stared back at her from the clip photo was too young to be there. Soft jawline, wide eyes. Just a kid caught stealing a sandwich and a sports drink. No weapon, no prior record, arrested, cuffed, and tried like a career criminal. The presiding judge, Marshall Gaines. Selene scanned the transcript. The prosecutor made a show of presenting Zion as a repeat in the making. Gaines nodded along, barely glancing at the boy. The public defender had tried to raise Zion's history unemployed mother, food insecurity, missed social services, but the motion was tossed. Selene remembered the phrase. This court doesn't traffic in excuses. She read it again, slower this time. It wasn't the harshest thing she'd ever seen in a ruling, but it was the most revealing. Zion had been sentenced to 8 months in juvenile detention for being hungry. Selene stared at the folder for a long moment, then slid it aside and reached for the second one, and the third. By nightfall, her desk was covered in a grid of folders, 12 of them each with a black or brown face staring back. Each one sentenced by Gaines under questionable circumstances. Some were denied bail despite no priors. Others had motions dismissed before being heard. 2 cases involved excessive force claims Gaines had laughed off. There was a pattern, one that couldn't be explained away by judicial discretion, one that spoke of bias, not law. And Selene had seen enough of these patterns to know when power's unchecked long enough, it stops hiding. The following morning, she made a quiet phone call to Elena Cruz, a former court clerk who had served under Gaines for nearly a decade before resigning without explanation. Elena agreed to meet after hours, behind the records room. No names, no paper trail. At 7:13 p.m., Selene slipped down the back corridor of the courthouse, past dusty portraits of long-retired judges, toward a door left slightly ajar. The records room was dark, save for the faint glow of a desk lamp. Elena stood inside, her cardigan frayed at the cuffs, face pale under the weak light. Her voice barely registered above a whisper. "I know who you are," she said. "Not your name, but I know what you're doing." Selene didn't respond. She didn't need to. Elena continued. "I typed 100 orders for him, motions denied before they were even reviewed. One time he told me, some of these defense attorneys are just public-funded babysitters. He didn't even look at the files, just made the ruling." She looked down at her hand, nervously twisting her wedding ring. "I didn't say anything then. I needed the job. Still do." From her coat pocket, she pulled out a USB drive, wrapped in an old receipt. "This has copies of internal memos, notes from hearings, and a few red-line draft rulings. Some of them show what he planned to write before even hearing the arguments." Selene accepted it silently, nodding once. There was no need for a thank you, only acknowledgement. As she left the room, she didn't walk faster. She didn't look behind her, but in her hand, She held something that mattered more than any press headline ever could. The next day, Selene contacted Nathan Kim, a former public defender now working as a juvenile rights advocate. They had crossed paths once, briefly, during an oversight audit. She remembered his refusal to sign off on a settlement that left out a boy's trauma report. That mattered. Nathan agreed to meet. His office was modest, tucked behind a youth shelter on the south side. "I'll be straight with you," he said, handing her a file marked Darius Hill, 17. Judge Gaines buried this kid, called him a menace. Know what he did? Skipped a court-ordered job training course because his sister had a seizure. He missed one check-in, and they locked him up for violating probation. He paused. "I don't have a badge like you, but I've been watching him for years." Selene scanned the file, then looked up. "Would you be willing to go on record?" Nathan hesitated. "I could lose funding. My board doesn't want trouble." "I understand," Selene said quietly. He leaned forward. "But I'll do it anyway." By the end of the week, Selene had compiled a growing case file. It now included 14 high-risk sentencing decisions with racial patterns, 3 witness affidavits, 1 internal memo with pre-written judicial outcomes, 2 suppressed video clips showing courtroom misconduct. And still, Selene knew that this wasn't enough, because exposing the system required more than facts. It required truth wrapped in courage. That night, she sat in her office, watching the city lights blur through the cracked blinds. Her badge lay beside her again. The name etched into the metal felt heavier than ever. She thought of Zion, of the way he looked down when he spoke, like already believing he wouldn't be heard. She thought of Elena, handing over a drive with fingers trembling, and of Nathan, choosing justice over comfort. Selene didn't plan revenge. She planned reckoning, and this time, she wouldn't be dismissed. Because the next time she walked into that courtroom, she wasn't coming as an observer. She was coming with authority, evidence, and something Judge Gaines had never seen before: accountability. The sun rose slowly over Grayston, casting long shadows through the tall windows of the courthouse. But courtroom 4C wasn't ready for what was about to walk through its doors. At exactly 9 a.m., Selene Ward stepped inside, not as Anna Mercer this time, not as a quiet observer in soft shoes, but as herself. Senior Federal Inspector, Office of the Inspector General. Her charcoal gray suit was crisply pressed. A slim gold badge hung from a lanyard around her neck, swaying slightly as she moved. Her heels clicked against the tile with a calm rhythm, a cadence that didn't demand attention, but earned it. Every head turned. A young clerk dropped her pen. A bailiff stood a little straighter. Even the stenographer paused mid-keystroke. They recognized her now, not from a name. From the moment, from the video, the woman who had been told to leave was now the one watching everyone else. Selene made no announcement. She simply took a seat, same row, third from the front, the exact spot where she had once been dismissed, behind her. A junior officer texted quietly under the bench. "She's back, full badge, sitting like she owns the room. Sent to court administrator, judge's office, legal comms group." Judge Marshall Gaines entered 5 minutes later. He stepped in with practiced authority, robe flowing, eyes sharp, but as his gaze swept the room, it caught something unexpected. Her, Selene, same face, same posture, but everything else had changed. She wasn't scribbling notes now. She wasn't trying to blend in. She was here seen, known, and undeniable. For a moment, he faltered. Just a heartbeat, a pause barely noticeable to anyone else. But Selene saw it. She always saw it. He sat down, gavel in hand. "Let's proceed," he said, though his voice had a hitch in it, subtle, a fracture. The morning docket moved slowly. Gaines was curt, more abrupt than usual. He dismissed motions without elaboration, skipped explanations. Eyes flicked constantly to Selene. He never met her stare directly, until he had no choice. During a break between cases, he looked up and addressed her. "Ms. Ward," he said, his tone tight but civil. "If you're here in any official capacity, I trust you've coordinated with the court." Selene closed her notebook calmly. "I'm simply observing, Your Honor. You once said this room wasn't for activists. I assume it still welcomes oversight." The room stilled. A few attorneys exchanged glances. The stenographer raised her eyes. Gaines offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, we have nothing to hide." But his fingers gripped the edge of the bench too tightly. At 1:04 p.m., a note arrived at the bench. Folded. No letterhead. Just 5 words. "Room 2F. Now. Internal review." Gaines stared at the handwriting. He didn't look at the messenger. He stood, announced an unscheduled recess, and left through the side door. Room 2F had no windows, just a long table, 6 chairs, and silence. Selene sat alone at one end. Her badge lay flat in front of her. Her file folders stacked neatly beside it. She didn't rise when Gaines entered. She didn't smile. "Inspector Ward," he said, voice flat. "You could have introduced yourself in court." "I did," she replied evenly. "You told me to leave." A beat of silence. Then she slid a manila folder across the table. He opened it. 12 cases, affidavits, transcripts, 2 internal memos, video stills, and something else, a signed statement from a retired prosecutor who had worked under Gaines. His signature undeniable. "You've been preparing this," Gaines muttered. "I've been watching," Selene corrected. "Now I'm reviewing." His tone shifted, defensive. "You have no idea the pressures we deal with. The backlog, the media scrutiny, the demands of communities that want justice in headlines, not due process." "You're right," Selene said softly. "I don't know your pressures, but I know this." She picked up a small remote and pressed play. On a wall-mounted monitor, silent footage played Courtroom 4C 2 years ago. A black teenager, nervous, speaking softly. Gaines, leaning forward, voice raised, hand slamming the bench. No sound, but the body language was undeniable. "You called him a street statistic waiting to happen," Selene said, her voice calm. "You dismissed his testimony, not because of facts, but because of how he looked, how he sounded, who you assumed he was." Gaines said nothing. Selene continued. "Bias is human, but unchecked, it becomes systemic. And when you wear that robe, your biases become law." She leaned forward slightly, not aggressive, just anchored. "This isn't a witch hunt. This is accountability. You've forgotten who that bench belongs to." Gaines looked down, at the folder, at his own name on the documents, at the reflection of who he had become. For the first time in 20 years, he had no ruling, no speech, no gavel, just silence. That evening, back in his chambers, He didn't return to court. He sat at his desk, coffee cold, hands clasped. He made 3 phone calls, one to a senator, one to a friend in the bar association, one to a journalist contact. All gave the same answer. She's not building a case. She already built it. You're alone on this. Take the retirement. Quietly. And so he did. The next morning, a single-page notice was posted outside the courthouse clerk's office. Effective immediately, Judge Marshall Gaines has chosen to step down from the bench. No further comment. There were no reporters, no statement, no defense. But by noon, the news had already spread. And in the quiet of that courthouse, something had shifted. Not because of shouting, not because of protest signs, because a woman had walked back into a room she was once cast out from and reminded it who it belonged to. The room was still, no robes, no juries, no rows of observers this time, just a long rectangular table inside the State Judicial Oversight Office. 2 senior judges, 1 federal liaison, a representative from the Juvenile Justice Board, and across from them, Selene Ward. She stood, her back straight, her tone calm, as she placed a thin folder in the center of the table. On the cover, written in block letters, Zion Kelly, emergency petition for case reconsideration. The room did not erupt. There were no murmurs, no interruptions. These were professional, seasoned men and women used to measured words and procedural rhythms. But as Selene opened the folder, something changed. The air felt heavier. Even the blinds seemed to stand still. I present this under the authority granted by the Office of Inspector General, she began. This case, handled by now retired Judge Marshall Gaines, reflects a pattern of judicial overreach, biased assumption, and the systemic failure to account for mitigating circumstances. She didn't dramatize the moment. She didn't need to. The facts already did that. Zion Kelly was 15 when he was arrested behind a corner store. No weapon, no assault, just a sandwich and a bottle of juice, half-eaten, tucked into his backpack. His mother, who worked nights as a janitor, didn't even know he'd skipped school. The clerk had waved it off, said the kid looked scared, not dangerous. But the responding officer cuffed him, filed a report, and referred the case to juvenile court. The judge that day, Gaines, never asked about Zion's family, his school records, or even his access to food at home. He didn't look at the child. Just read the police report, shook his head, and called him a repeat in the making. 8 months in juvenile detention. Selene laid out the original transcript and slowly turned it to page 7. There it was. We have every reason to believe this young man is a repeat in the making. This court will not wait for escalation. 8 months detention. Case closed. No context, no compassion, no correction. She looked at the faces around the table. Some stared at the paper. Others avoided eye contact altogether. A few pressed their pens into their notepads a little too hard. This boy, she said quietly, was hungry, and for that, the court treated him like he was already lost. She didn't cry, didn't raise her voice, but her stillness carried more weight than any volume. The silence that followed was long, dense. Then she slid forward a clean petition, already co-signed by Zion's new advocate, a state-appointed therapist, and the juvenile justice representative. One signature left, Selene said, placing a pen next to the paper. The 2 senior judges exchanged a look, And slowly, deliberately, they signed. Zion Kelly's record was expunged that afternoon. But what happened in that room would ripple far beyond one name. Outside the courthouse, there were no cameras, no chants, just a handful of people standing on the steps, unsure whether to cheer or just breathe. A school teacher who had once tutored Zion, a neighbor who used to slip him granola bars through the fence, a woman with a stroller and tired eyes, and then a voice small, curious cut through the stillness. "Mom, is she a judge now?" A little girl, no more than 7, tugged her mother's sleeve and pointed at Selene as she stepped into the afternoon sun, briefcase in hand. Her mother didn't answer right away. She looked at Selene standing tall but not proud, purposeful but not boastful. She bent down and whispered into her daughter's ear, "No, baby. She's the one who makes judges think twice." Back in her office that evening, Selene sat by the window, her blazer draped over the chair, the gold badge now resting in a desk drawer. The Zion Kelly file was closed, but the work wasn't done. She turned on the monitor and opened a secure folder. Case Review Judicial Pattern Investigation. Status ongoing. 12 more names. 12 more stories. And a system that had grown too used to silence. Selene had once believed that justice was about rules and statutes. Now, she understood it was about who gets seen and who doesn't. It was about the moments when a courtroom chooses not to ask why. About kids who grow up thinking the world already decided who they were. And it was about people, quiet people, who decided to stay standing even after they'd been told to leave. The next morning, a news clip circulated on local radio. Grayston's juvenile court system is under review after the Office of Inspector General reopened the case of Zion Kelly, a 15-year-old boy previously sentenced to 8 months in detention for a non-violent petty theft. The presiding judge in the case, Marshall Gaines, recently retired amid allegations of racial bias in sentencing. No official statement has been released, but a video showing Inspector Selene Ward being dismissed from the courtroom weeks prior has now gone viral, earning her the nickname, the Quiet Watcher. Selene never read the comments, but someone printed one and taped it to her door. It read, "She didn't fight. She didn't shout. She didn't storm the bench. She just waited. And when the time was right, she reminded the system who it's supposed to serve." In that, Selene found no celebration, only clarity. Justice didn't need noise. It needed presence, persistence, and people who knew when to listen louder than they spoke. Zion's name was no longer just a case number in a dusty file. It was now a reason. And for Selene, that was enough for now. The photo was black and white, tucked into the corner of a newspaper clipping from 12 years ago. It showed a younger judge, Marshall Gaines, shaking hands with the mayor. A headline crowning them both, "A New Era of Discipline in the Courtroom." But the era had ended. And not with a scandal. Not with sirens. It ended the way rot always does, quietly. And from within. The clip played again on Selene's screen. Grainy video. Shaky hands. The original moment when she'd been dismissed from the courtroom, told to leave by a judge who didn't know who she was. Told she had no place in the room. It now had over 2.7 million views. People didn't watch it for outrage. They watched it for stillness, for the calm with which she stood, the grace with which she walked out, and the silence that remained long after the door had closed. But that silence had grown loud. It started with a whisper, one clerk from another district reaching out, then a second, a former public defender from another county, a probation officer, a mother who still had the court transcripts from her son's unjust hearing. Selene's inbox, once monitored with habit, now pulsed with urgency. Subject lines read, "Please look into Judge Harrison, Ninth Circuit. I have footage I wasn't supposed to keep." My case was closed, but it never felt finished. It was like the courthouse had cracked, and behind the walls, people were ready to talk. Not all were willing to go public. Not yet, but they no longer believed they were alone. Selene met quietly with her team federal staffers, legal analysts, one trauma-informed investigator. They worked from her office and across makeshift satellite desks in borrowed rooms. The cases were being reopened one by one. Judge Gaines had been the trigger, but he wasn't the whole structure. The system had built a culture where leniency depended on last names, where poverty was criminalized, where punishment was distributed like it was supposed to teach shame rather than restore dignity. Selene stared at a wall covered in names. Each pinned file had a timeline, a transcript excerpt, and a list of overlooked details. Ages 13, 16, 19, race Black, Latino, Indigenous. One stood out. Case No, 11/2027, Jaron Miles, 17 at the time of arrest. Charged with obstruction after asking police why they were searching his backpack, he had recorded the incident on his phone footage that was accidentally deleted by officers. The phone, however, had auto-uploaded the video to his cloud account. Selene clicked play. The footage showed Jaron speaking calmly, asking questions. He never raised his voice, never resisted. The officer's tone, however, turned aggressive, threats, a hand on the holster, then cuffs. The judge in that case, not Gaines, had denied the motion to admit the video into evidence, stating it was not legally retrieved. Jaron served 4 months. His college acceptance was rescinded. His public defender filed a complaint. It was ignored. Selene closed the file. Her heart didn't pound. That had stopped months ago. Now it just settled heavier in her chest, like a weight she'd grown used to carrying. She turned to her team. Pull the judge's last 15 rulings. Compare sentence lengths across racial lines. One analyst raised an eyebrow. You think this goes higher? Selene didn't blink. I think it never stopped. Outside, the city moved as if nothing had changed. Cars honked, coffee shops buzzed, courtrooms opened on time. But inside the halls of justice, whispers had turned into meetings. Judicial review boards were no longer rubber-stamping retirements. Petitions for resentencing were quietly piling up. And a new term had begun circulating in policy circles, implicit pattern response doctrine, a method of reviewing verdicts not just for legality, but for equity. The language of reform was no longer abstract. It was personal. One night, Selene sat alone on a bench across from the courthouse steps. She wasn't there for a case. She just needed to see it. The building stood as it always had, grand, rigid, untouched. But she could feel it now. Not a shift in stone or wood, a shift in presence. The way people entered slower. The way young attorneys paused before speaking. The way clerks sat straighter when she passed. Not out of fear, but awareness. She wasn't chasing justice anymore. She was changing the way justice behaved in a room. Later that week, a call came through. It wasn't anonymous. It was from Judge Edith Monroe, the longest-sitting appellate judge in the state. "Inspector Ward," she said, voice sharp with age but softened by respect. We've received your recommendations. Selene remained quiet. Monroe continued. I'd like you to consider taking a permanent seat on the independent oversight panel, starting this quarter. Selene didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her hands, still ink-stained from hours of note-taking. Then, not yet, Monroe paused. You're turning down authority. Selene exhaled, voice steady. No, I'm still using it, just not from behind a desk. By the time the legislative hearings rolled around, Selene had already prepared 3 full reports. Bias in pretrial detention, dismissal patterns among minority youth cases, judicial language and its psychological impacts on defendants. She didn't testify with emotion. She didn't need to. She testified with precision. One senator leaned over to his aide halfway through her presentation and whispered, "She's not trying to change the system. She's rewriting its instructions." And when the first judge was officially disbarred, not for corruption, but for long-term bias and repeated miscarriage of equitable justice, the press didn't use her name. They didn't have to. People already knew. They remembered the woman in the navy sweater, the one who didn't speak when she was ordered to leave, the one who came back not with rage, but with receipts. They called it the Ward effect, but Selene never claimed it. She just kept showing up. The morning air was different. There wasn't a chill, not quite, but a stillness. Like the city was holding its breath. Like the courthouse, stoic and unmoved for decades, had begun listening. Selene Ward stood before it, not in uniform, not in armor, just in silence. Her suit was plain charcoal. No badge hung from her neck today. It rested in her hand instead, its gold seal dull in the soft light. She wasn't there to flash authority, not anymore. She was there to say goodbye, not to the work, but to the way she used to do it. Inside courtroom 4C, the same walls remained, the same seats, the same silence. But the energy had changed. Today, Selene wasn't sitting in the third row. She stood at the front, beside the new presiding judge, Leah Connor, a black woman in her early 40s, with steady eyes and a voice like steel wrapped in velvet. She had once watched Selene testify before the Oversight Committee. She remembered thinking, that woman doesn't speak to impress. She speaks to shift tectonic plates. Now, Selene stood beside her as she took the oath. Leah raised her hand and recited the words with quiet conviction, her gaze never once faltering. When it was done, the room didn't erupt in applause. It didn't need to. Selene met Leah's eyes. She gave a small nod. Nothing ceremonial, just something honest. Something that said, "You've earned this, now carry it." Leah nodded back. "And I will." That evening, Selene walked alone, not out of loneliness, but out of ritual. She always believed the weight of justice should be carried on foot, not in motorcades. She passed the same coffee shop where she used to overhear clerks whisper about the lady in blue. She passed a mural someone had painted across a utility wall, a rendering of a courtroom with no faces, just silhouettes, and in the corner, a single line of text. Sometimes the loudest voice in the room is the one that stood and left. She stopped to read it, not as flattery, as memory. Back in her apartment, the sun was setting across the skyline. She sat by the window with a mug of lukewarm tea and pulled a small box from her bookshelf. Inside were notes, handwritten, folded, some worn at the edges. Messages people had left or mailed or handed her without many words. One read, "You helped my brother get a second chance. He didn't waste it. Thank you." Another, I still remember when you walked out of the courtroom. I teach high school now. I teach my students that quiet doesn't mean powerless, and one, written on a wrinkled piece of notebook paper and pencil, I saw you, and that was enough to make me believe I existed. Selene folded that one again with care. She placed it back in the box and closed it. She wasn't retiring, not from the work, but she was no longer walking into broken rooms hoping they would change. She had changed them already, just by refusing to leave them unchanged. Weeks later, at a community law center across town, Selene gave her first workshop, not on law, on presence. There were no legal citations, no PowerPoint slides, just a room full of young advocates, law students, public defenders, and even a few activists who had once been dismissed for being too loud. Selene stood at the front, hands folded. The room waited. Then she said, "There's a myth in the system that the loudest person wins, that you have to dominate to be heard. But justice doesn't move because someone yells. It moves because someone keeps showing up, even when they're told not to." She paused, her voice gentle but immovable. "You don't have to scream to be dangerous. You just have to stay." A student in the back raised their hand. "What if staying gets you nowhere?" Selene looked at them, eyes steady. "Then you stand up, walk out, and come back with truth in your hands. That's when the room starts shifting." The room was silent. And that silence, the respectful kind, the resonant kind, was everything Selene ever wanted her work to become. Later that month, a national journal published an editorial titled "The Woman Who Rewrote the Room." It described her not as a prosecutor, not as a revolutionary, but as an architect of discomfort, someone who forced the system to confront its reflection in the mirror. Selene read the article, then placed it under a stack of documents and moved on. Because she wasn't building a legacy, she was passing it forward. Across the city, in classrooms, courtrooms, waiting rooms, her name was no longer whispered in uncertainty. It was spoken with intention, not because she had power, but because she had chosen to hold it without crushing others beneath it. She had become the kind of figure people pointed to, not with awe, but with understanding. She didn't just fight the system, she reminded it what it was supposed to be. One morning, Selene visited a juvenile detention center, quietly, no cameras, no press. She walked through the halls, meeting with counselors, checking on reforms now in place. In one of the common areas, a boy no older than 15 looked up from his book and blinked. "You're her," he said softly. Selene smiled. "I'm just visiting." "No," he said with voice steady. "You're the reason they stopped calling us cases and started calling us by our names." She didn't answer, just placed a hand over her heart and sat beside him to listen. That night, as she stood once more at the edge of the courthouse steps, the wind brushed softly through the city streets. The lights inside were still on. New judges, new policies, new possibilities. Selene Ward turned away, not from the mission, but toward the next room that needed shifting. Because legacy isn't built when you arrive. It's built by how you leave. It had been months since Selene Ward last stepped into courtroom 4C. The city had moved forward, new judges sworn in, review boards formalized, policies rewritten in language more human than procedural. Her name no longer made headlines. It didn't have to. The shift had already taken root. But on a quiet Wednesday morning, Selene returned not as an inspector, not as a guest of honor, just herself. No badge, no title, only a folded letter in her hand and a memory at her side. She sat in the back row this time, farther than before, watching. The judge presiding today, Leah Connor, once mentored by Selene, opened the session with warmth and clarity. The room, though familiar, felt different now. Lighter, more deliberate, less ruled, more led. Selene listened as a young defense attorney stood to speak on behalf of a teen facing a minor infraction. The boy, nervous and fidgeting, gripped the edge of his table. But this time, the courtroom waited. No interruptions, no dismissals. When the judge asked, "What led to this decision?" she wasn't fishing for guilt. She was searching for context. Selene smiled. The room had changed, and more importantly, it remembered her. When the session ended, Selene left her letter with the bailiff. It wasn't addressed to any judge or committee. It was addressed simply to whoever sits here next inside. It read, "You will inherit this bench, but not its habits. You will carry authority, but not its arrogance. And you will shape this room with every word you allow and every silence you let speak. May you always ask why, even when the law says you don't have to. And may you always remember the people sitting in front of you were once children. Treat them like someone once failed to." Later that afternoon, a court clerk new to the building asked a colleague, "Who was she?" The answer came without hesitation. "She's the one who made the room sit up straighter." She didn't raise her voice, but somehow it echoes in here. Still, and outside, the city kept moving. But in courtroom 4C, every time someone stood, every time a child's name was spoken with dignity, every time a ruling was made with both firmness and mercy, a small part of the room would pause and remember the woman who once stood and walked away, not in defeat, but to return with the truth. In a world that often rewards volume over value, it's easy to believe that only the loudest voices create change. But true transformation rarely begins with noise. It begins with presence. The story of Selene Ward reminds us that dignity, consistency, and quiet conviction can be more powerful than protest signs or public declarations. We live in a time where systems, legal, educational, societal, are being questioned, and they should be. But questioning doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes it looks like refusing to walk away, like watching closely when no one else is paying attention, or like standing up and returning to a place that once told you to leave. Selene's story speaks to all of us, those who've been underestimated, dismissed, or overlooked, not to seek revenge, but to be the shift, to show up again, not with rage, but with truth and purpose. Injustice isn't always loud, but neither is integrity. And sometimes, the most revolutionary act is to listen carefully, walk calmly, and come back with the power to change the room, not just for yourself, but for everyone who was told they didn't belong in it. That's how legacy begins in silence that refuses to disappear.